Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of everyone here at SCS Global Services, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm your host, Tom Ehart, SCS's Corporate Marketing Director, and our moderator today is Karen Righthand, SCS's Managing Director of Corporate Sales and Marketing. Karen, thank you for joining us today. Before I introduce our topic and today's guests, I'd like to take a moment to update all of our listeners on the event platform, GoToWebinar, and how to engage with the speakers. To avoid any unnecessary background noises during this presentation, all attendees have been muted. This will be a one-way presentation for the duration of the event. If you would like to ask a question, please go to the questions section in the control panel on the upper right-hand side of your webinar console. Once you type your question and hit send, your question will be sent to the panel for review. Depending on the time remaining at the end of the presentation, we will make every effort to answer all questions submitted. Any questions that we're unable to answer will be responded to after the event by a member of the panel. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees and registrants after the webinar has concluded. And with that being said, Karen, I'm really excited to be kicking off the second quarter of 2021 with this new webinar series called Navigating ESG, a three-part in-depth look at ESG priorities and reporting best practices. There's such a push from the investment world nowadays for greater corporate ESG transparency and accountability, and for many companies, living up to the new ESG paradigm can be a daunting task. In addition to today's discussion, our second webinar in the series will focus on ESG reporting and choosing the right approach for your company, which we'll host on Wednesday, April 21st. And the final webinar will focus on sustainability report assurance, how to verify your ESG journey, which will be held on Wednesday, May 5th. We hope all of our attendees will be able to join us for those webinars as well. But today we'd like to focus on a topic that many companies are trying to address, and that is creating a corporate blueprint for ESG success. Karen, we've got some great guests to share their insights with us today. So how about if we introduce them now?
Thanks, Tom. Our first guest is someone I've had the pleasure and honor of working with for the past 4 years on a number of sustainability and reporting initiatives. Julie Childers is the Director of Corporate Sustainability at Owens Corning. And our second guest today is Brittany Supanik, Senior Manager at SCS Consulting Services. Introducing Brittany reminds me that I'd like to say just a couple words about SCS Global Services and SCS Consulting. For those of you that have product certifications or other services with us, you may not have known that we also now have a full consulting team. SCS Consulting is an independent entity capable of helping you with your sustainability questions and initiatives without creating conflict of interest on the SCS Global Services certification and verification side of things. It has been a tremendous advantage to have a consulting arm, and I believe this webinar will demonstrate that. For those of you new to SCS Global Services, we are a full-service sustainability, food safety, auditing, certification, and verification body that has been a pioneer in this space, working for nearly 4 decades now to advance sustainability in order to ensure a healthy planet and thriving economy that works for everyone. With that, I'm going to turn the reins over to Brittany and Julie. Don't forget to submit your questions as we go. I'll be monitoring the questions and we'll moderate them at the end, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much for joining today, everyone. Today, we're really excited to share some potential pathways that your company can explore as you learn to develop and prioritize ESG topics for your company. As Tom mentioned in the beginning, we've been getting a lot of questions, especially recently, about how to prioritize ESG topics. So we hope that today we can provide you some options for you to consider for your company. So we'll be discussing 4 methods for you today. And again, we're hoping you can not only learn about those methods, but also understand how the pros and cons of each method could help you in your journey. And at the end of this webinar, we'll discuss how those ESG priorities can then translate to corporate goals and ultimately to sustainability reporting. And as Tom mentioned, our second webinar will focus a lot on reporting. So if you want to learn more about that, make sure to tune in for that section. So to begin the webinar today, we should all just discuss the elephant in the room. Navigating ESG can be incredibly daunting. especially for folks who are just beginning their journey. Ultimately, there are several things to consider, a lot of stakeholders' voices that need to be heard, a lot of topics internally and externally to discuss. And the challenge is that all these things are often interconnected. And it can be very difficult to understand where your time, budget, energy, and resources should be spent. And so again, just setting the stage, that's the goal of today. We're hoping to provide you with some options on how you may limit this list to the ones that are most crucial for your company to focus on right away. So to answer, how do you actually determine what that is? We'll go through these 4 different methods. The first of which is a gap assessment. Many of you will be very familiar with this already, but ultimately it's using a standard or a framework to assess your performance gaps. We'll also discuss benchmarking, so how you compare to other industry peers in terms of ESG performance. We'll discuss risk assessments, so how you evaluate risks to help identify priorities, but also opportunities to differentiate your company. And then lastly, we'll go through materiality. And if you don't know what that means or what that is, that's okay. We will demystify that for you throughout the course of this webinar. But ultimately, it's where you engage your stakeholders very explicitly on what their priorities are, and then also quantify the potential impacts of those priorities to help determine what you should focus on as a company. And we will be spending a little bit more time on this last one, since we've been asked about it quite frequently and it's a little bit more vague. So we'll demystify that for you a little bit. So in the next several slides, what you'll see is an overall process for how you can typically engage in these 4 different options to establish ESG priorities. We'll show you a simplified example for each one and also discuss the pros and cons. And we'll invite Julie to speak about her experience with each of these methods from Owens Corning's perspective. So without further ado, we'll start with the gap assessment. So again, this is using an existing standard or ESG framework to assess gaps. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what are the multitude of different frameworks and standards that I could use to help figure out gaps. We've listed several here. These are by no means an exhaustive list, but we wanted to give you a sense of the type of frameworks and standards that you may or may not want to include in your gap assessment. So once you identify the multitude of standards that are out there, and again, we'll discuss several of these in our second webinar, you'll then need to select one or a couple of them to assess your company against. So the best way to do that is to figure out from your stakeholders which standards and frameworks are most important. For example, your investors may end up asking about a certain framework quite frequently and you haven't reported on it yet. So you can speak with your investor relations person to understand what their needs are. Similarly, your sales representatives may be asked about certain initiatives or standards that you do or do not comply with. So you can get a sense from your internal and also external stakeholders what to prioritize in terms of a framework. Another thing to do is ask internally about what you already report to and what ratings you may already be assessed against. It sounds simple, but companies are often very large and siloed and there's multiple geographies, so you may not necessarily know what you're already doing. So really talking internally and throughout the organization can help figure out which standard to focus on. And for the context of this webinar, we're really focusing on corporate strategy, broader ESG strategy. So the last bullet point here is just to recommend using a framework that allows you to do that. So really not focusing on a product specific certification, for example. We're talking more holistically enterprise level corporate strategy. So once you identify and select the standards or frameworks you want to assess your company against, the next thing is really just to assess gaps. On the right-hand side, we have a very simplified example, but ultimately you can see in the red boxes, those are all the areas that this fictional company does not, meet in terms of requirements for the standards that they are assessing against. So we'll show you a real example now in the next slide as we go through the pros and cons of this method. So here is an example of an ISS ESG rating gap assessment. It's simplified for the purposes of this webinar. But ultimately, you can see the indicators on the left-hand side, the big buckets, social and governance and environmental, and then specific topics within each. On the right-hand side, you can see the company's score. And you can also see the weight of those scores from ISS ESG's perspective and where they did or did not meet requirements. So this is really helpful for several reasons. It allows you to think through like broad macro topic categories of what to focus on. It also, in some cases, not all frameworks or rating systems do this, but you may have a score associated with it specific to your company. So understanding what your current score is helps you understand, of course, what gaps exist or where you need to prioritize your time and efforts. And sometimes, depending on the rating framework, it'll also give you an assessment against your industry peers. So it gives you a really good sense of where you are in relation to your competitors. Another great thing about this is that sometimes, there is a weighting. So, the framework or standard may tell you what the level of importance that they view on these topics compared to others. It can also help you to prioritize. So for this company, their environmental rating was low. It was a D+. So they know that they need to focus on that, not only because they didn't score that well, but also because it's weighted very highly. And then another benefit is that within each category, there are, of course, specific criteria that you can then assess your gaps against. So for this instance, this company knew right away, hey, I need to focus on resource efficiency, substances of concern, and environmental supplier audits. So it's really a way to establish a roadmap based on an existing standard and framework. Just like anything, there are some challenges or cons associated with these assessments as well. So the first one is that it's often internal facing, right? You're only focusing on your company, and it's also focused on a specific standard, which can be challenging because you may not really be looking at things that the broader industry is, especially if the standard is not industry specific. Another challenge is that stakeholders are not explicitly included in the assessment, and we often and always really recommend doing that to make sure that you're addressing their concerns. And so you just have to make sure to incorporate that and make sure that they know what you're prioritizing and why. And oftentimes with gap assessments in particular, because you focus so much on the details, the specific criteria, sometimes that broader corporate strategy, the direction that your company is trying to move forward with can get lost because you get focused on the details. So it's just something to keep an eye out for if you perform a gap assessment. Always bring it back to the bigger picture and what ultimately your company is trying to achieve. So now I'll let Julie join us for a minute and talk to her about her experience at Owens Corning and how they use gap assessments there.
Thank you very much. So we do gap assessments on an ongoing basis. So we continue to refresh and iterate. I would recommend, as you had mentioned, potentially selecting more than one framework to compare against. There's a lot of overlap, and it helps you see those pieces that if you report a certain area, for example, resource efficiency, it'll target several different frameworks, not just one. One thing I will say is use these gap assessments internally, right, to be able to close those gaps. So before you even report, so you can do the gap assessment, do the analysis and say, okay, we're going to choose to report 2 of these while these 3 we're going to work on internally, get our processes and our positions in place, build the strategy, build the process, and then report it publicly in 1, 2, or 3 years. It's a great opportunity to really evaluate where you are and evaluate where you want to move in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, moving along to the second method that you can use to determine corporate priorities. So this is where a benchmarking assessment, you can assess your performance against industry peers and competitors. So the first thing you need to do is really identify who you are going to assess against. Which peers or competitors do you want to look at? We always recommend including stretch competitors. So basically your ESG rock stars, so you can understand what the North Star looks like and have something to aspire to over time as your journey, as you continue on your journey. You can also incorporate other industries. You don't have to stay specifically within your own. It'll help give you some ideas of what other companies are prioritizing and how they're communicating it publicly. Optionally, you can also focus on a specific area. So, for example, if you are considering a science-based target, you may want to focus on benchmarking other companies in the industry based specifically on a science-based target. Here we're talking more about the corporate level structure. So using those industry standards we mentioned previously is a great option to benchmark against, and we'll show you an example of what that looks like. So once you identify what industry peers you want to assess against, you'll then need to, or the options of industry peers to assess against, you'll want to select those. And again, that comes down to talking internally with your stakeholders. So you may have sales representatives who are asked how your ESG efforts compare to a specific company in the industry. You want to be able to arm them with that information. So including those companies is really helpful. And also, you'll need to select, if you decide to focus on a specific framework, you'll need to select what that looks like. So the example we're going to show is with the Global Reporting Initiative. So once you select who you're going to assess yourselves against and what framework, if you decide to use a framework, you'll use for the benchmarking, the next step is really to do the benchmarking assessment. And it's very similar to a gap assessment. You're really just figuring out how your company compares to your industry peers. So again, on the right-hand side is a very simplified example where we have the same categories we showed previously. You have 3 different competitors in this case, and then you assess that against your company. And the red boxes show where your gaps are, so maybe where you want to consider prioritizing. And then there are also ways to show what opportunities there are. So that's the green box, where potentially no one in your industry is focusing on something, and there may be a really good reason for that, but there also may be a reason for you to focus on it and differentiate yourselves compared to peers. So again, using a real life example, we'll just share the pros and cons by describing this Global Reporting Initiative peer benchmarking assessment that we conducted recently. So we're just showing you basically 10 topics from GRI just for the illustration purposes. And on the right-hand side, you can see how the company compares to 3 of their peers. And what's really helpful about this is you can see really where you are overperforming compared to peers. That can help frame your ESG story. You can also see where there are opportunities, perhaps where nobody else is focusing on that in your industry. As long as there's a material reason for you to do so, that's a great way to differentiate yourselves and share how you're going above and beyond in some cases than your competitors. It also helps reveal gaps. So, if all of your competitors or peers are focusing on something, then it's likely that you should also be focusing on it. That's a really great way to determine priorities. And lastly, it just really helps educate you on what other companies are sharing externally, especially for those who are just starting your journey. It's really hard to determine what you want to publicly communicate, and it can be really daunting making public commitments. So it's a really great way for you to get educated on how others are communicating their journey and giving you some ideas of how you might want to do that as well. Similarly, there's, with anything, there's some cons. So we just wanted to throw out some things for you to look out for benchmarking. The first one is probably pretty obvious, but ultimately you're limited to publicly available information. So you may not have a really good idea of what some of your competitors are doing unless they're sharing it transparently and publicly. So you're limited to what's available. Because you're looking at your competitors and not focusing necessarily on your company, sometimes people lose sight of what internal pressures or initiatives you want to assess and focus on. So it's just something to keep in mind. If your company is trying to focus on a specific initiative, just don't forget to include that because that'll be key as you evaluate yourselves against your industry. Similar to gap assessment, stakeholders are not explicitly included, so that's something to keep an eye out for. And then also similar to gap assessment, sometimes when you focus so specifically on the details and figuring out what specific categories are covered in your industry and which aren't, you can lose sight of the broader strategy. So always take it back out and think holistically, bird's eye level. Why are we focusing on this? What am I communicating to my peers and to my stakeholders? And I'll invite Julie back in to talk to you about her experience with Owens Corning.
Yes, thank you. So we do benchmarking assessments on an ongoing basis as well. We, as part of our process, may not benchmark every area at one time. We may select something like diversity and equal opportunity and at one time and benchmark our competitors, our best in class, as well as potentially our customers, depending on your business, and understanding the expectations there. What it helps us do is gain buy-in across the organization as well. If we're not reporting something and our competitors are, that could help drive change within the company by understanding where the market is moving, understanding where we're potentially behind or ahead of other companies. It is a great opportunity to really look at your areas of focus as well as those areas that you aren't focused on today, and you can build a roadmap to focus on in the future.
Fantastic. All right, moving on to the third method. So this is really doing a risk assessment to figure out what your ESG priorities should be, but also what potential opportunities may be out there. So this one is kind of particularly challenging because it's very dependent on the company. If you are just beginning, maybe a great place to start would be to look at existing frameworks. A lot of these already incorporate risk categories, so you can figure out what these frameworks are suggesting in terms of risk mitigation and evaluation to help guide you. So it's a great place to start. Take a look, see what they're looking at, or any industry-specific standards or ESG frameworks would be really helpful. You may already know about some in the industry, or maybe some Googling will help you figure out some examples of what to focus on. So once you figure out some options for a framework to assess risks, you'll need to determine which one you want to focus on. And it's similar to what Julie was saying here, you can use multiple frameworks. You can look at risks across multiple different industries and try to figure out what makes sense for you. And you can develop your own or add on your own risks to existing frameworks. So it's really up to you and what's driving the risk assessment itself. But a key part with anything is just asking your stakeholders. So ask leadership, what risks are they concerned about? What are your investors concerned about? Because risk mitigation is going to be a huge deal for them. So really understanding why you're evaluating risks and helping you through this process by using existing frameworks could really set you up for success. So here on the right-hand side is a very, again, simple framework. This is a real example where we just took out all of the information, but ultimately, typically when we assess risks, and I would recommend this to you as well, we look at different categories based on time horizons. So is it short, medium, or long-term risk? What is the likelihood of that risk actually happening? What's the scale of the risk? So if the risk happens, is it focused on one facility or all of your facilities, or one geography or all your geographies? And then what potential influence do you have on that risk? Do you have the ability to mitigate that, or do you need external partners to help you? And of course, what are the financial implications of the risk? And that'll be a huge driver, especially if you're working internally to get a budget to help with risk mitigation or evaluate options for navigating a certain risk. Knowing the financial costs or the potential costs is really helpful to make that story. And on the right, you can just basically prioritize based on whatever customized calculation you want to use. So in this case, there were two high risks, one in community and one in climate. And this can be very customized to your needs and to your business. So taking that same example, we're just going to illustrate and reiterate some of the pros of using this approach. Again, there are a lot of risk assessments. People do this very differently, but what's great about it, one of the great things, is that it encourages engagement across internal business lines. So sustainability and ESG should never really be focused in a silo. It should be across business units. And we've found with risk assessments in particular, it really encourages that process. You're going to need to work with multiple people to figure out what risks are available or are out there. And then it helps you focus on short-term risks. So, if there is something immediate that you need to do right away, that can help you prioritize what to focus on now, and then what to kind of monitor or manage for the next few years until you're ready to tackle it more explicitly. It also gives you insight into the potential scale of the risks. So if this risk happened, what would be the cost in terms of potential impact? And also what would be the potential actual cost, the financial impact of the risk? And just reiterating, you can customize your priority levels based on your own corporate objectives. So maybe you want to focus on a specific category, or you weigh things higher than others. It's really helpful to be able to do that. With this, there's also challenges. So one is that risk assessments, especially if you're just beginning and you're focusing on ESG for the first time, it may be difficult to do without external support. A lot of companies do risk assessments already, but they may not have experience incorporating ESG topics. So it's just something to keep an eye out for. If you do end up needing to hire external support, of course, that can be costly and time consuming. So that's something to keep an eye out for if you think you'll need some external support, getting a budget ready to be able to do that. And in addition to the benefits of coordinating with different teams internally, there are also challenges to that. So that's something to keep an eye out for. There will likely be competing objectives, competing priorities and perspectives. So it's just something to navigate as you go through this process. And then lastly, stakeholder engagement, again, is not explicitly included, but we definitely encourage you to incorporate your stakeholders' opinions, especially from your investors or wherever you're receiving the most pressure from. And I'll invite Julie to talk one more time about how their company focuses on risk assessments.
Yeah, thank you. So this is an example from our sustainability report that was just published last week on our risk register. So at Owens Corning, we evaluate risk, and ESG risk is evaluated within our normal risk process. So it happens at a plant level, then a business unit level, and a corporate level. And each one of those at the corporate level and the business unit level have their own registers, and those registers tell us where there's potential risk. As you can see here, based on the colors, the size or the type of the icon, and then the border around the icon tells us whether it's a new risk or an existing risk. And then if there's change in that risk, it allows us to evaluate. There's an owner as well as a process for moving forward with that risk. So it's a great opportunity for us to look at these and embed them within our existing processes.
Great, thank you. All right, so the last but not least, we're going to be talking about materiality assessments. And just a reminder, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into this one. So if you're not familiar with materiality, hopefully you'll soon understand what it means and what it entails. But ultimately, similar to the others, you first need to identify what, I guess, framework you want to use to identify materiality. So typically, materiality is defined by, people use the GRI definition, the Global Reporting Initiative, and the SASB definition, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So we're going to describe what each one of these is, but they define materiality a little bit differently. So you need to decide, first of all, which of these you want to use or a combination of the two. Most often, we recommend a combination of the two. Ultimately, once you figure out what framework you want to use, you'll need to figure out who then you should engage in terms of your stakeholders. So what I love about this process is that it explicitly involves stakeholders, and we'll describe what that means, but it's a really key part to understand what their priorities are to help guide your corporate decisions. And you'll also need to figure out what material aspects, it's just a fancy term for ESG topics, right? So what ESG topics do you need to consider in your materiality assessment? And on the right-hand side, this is a very simplified example output for a materiality assessment. Again, we'll share what this means a little bit more, but on the left-hand side, the y-axis, you can see the stakeholder priority. So you'll be able to measure each one of these topics, whether it's environmental, social, or governance topic, and whatever those topics are, on a scale, like say from 1 to 10. Similarly, on the x-axis, you'll identify what the potential impact is of that topic on environment and society. And everything in the upper right is really where your focus should be and your priorities should be. So to take that example and talk about the pros a little bit. So here we just filled in the topics to give it a little bit more color, I guess. This is a fake example. It's just simplified for ease of viewing. But ultimately, the great thing about materiality assessments is that stakeholders is a key part of the process. It also, enables measurement of stakeholder priorities. So if a stakeholder says, hey, I want you to focus on these 20 things, instead, it's actually asking them to rate what those priorities are on a scale. So you can help figure out what needs to happen first and what needs to happen later on. Similarly, on the x-axis, you can rate based on the potential impact of that topic. So in this case, how much impact does anti-corruption have on environment and society? So again, this scale really helps you quantify and demystify these topics and choose the ones that are most material to your company. And I think one of the great things about this is that it's just a great visual. It's really clear, and the methodology is very sound, and you can see on a simple image of what priorities you should focus on, and that'll help you guide all sorts of stakeholder discussions, but also your goals and setting priorities for your company. And it's a very familiar framework. So many companies use this, so it's something that is common, and a lot of your stakeholders will probably already be at least aware of it, even if they're not familiar with the term materiality itself. So to illustrate some of the challenges with this, I think one of the main ones is that the concept is relatively vague, and it can be open-ended. And by that I mean, you'll have to decide, do you want to interview 5 stakeholders or 2,000 stakeholders? So the cutoff line can be very ambiguous, and so it's hard to know where to start and where to stop. Another challenge with materiality assessments is that because stakeholders are involved and are a crucial piece of the process, it can take a lot of time and resources. So it's something you'll really have to plan for. And specifically with this one, more than the others even, it's difficult to do without external support. Especially as you're engaging with stakeholders, you want their honest, transparent opinion, and having a third party help navigate those interviews is much easier than conducting that yourself. So we often recommend that a third party be involved. And because of that, of course, that can also be time consuming and potentially costly. So Julie, would you like to share a little bit about your materiality assessments?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say, first of all, this can look overwhelming and really intensive, but I think you can break it down into parts. I would say our first materiality assessment was really nothing like our current one that we have today. It did take a significant amount of time. It was over almost a year. As part of our materiality process, we gathered what stakeholders we wanted to talk to, whether through surveys or interviews, and addressed kind of them into groups, into buckets, made a decision on which organizations we wanted within those buckets, and we ensured as part of this process as well that we looked at it from a regional perspective. We wanted to make sure that when we looked at materiality, if, for example, combating climate change, is it important in Americas as it is in Europe or Asia Pacific? It allows us to give that laser focus into different regions and help us understand potentially where we need to focus differently in our actions. As you can tell from our materiality, we also broke it down in product, environmental, and social, and that helped us understand what direction we were moving as well. Each one of these are outlined in our sustainability report and have goals representative of them too. I would say that some of the goals are a little more nebulous and some are very direct depending on what the material topic is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, as promised, we wanted to dive in a little bit more to materiality because it seems we're getting a lot of questions about it, and many of you in the call may have never heard of it before. So we just wanted to talk about the 2 frameworks that really define this for us. So the first one is GRI. I'm not going to read this to you, but ultimately GRI defines material topics as those being sufficiently important to your organization. And they ask you to measure that based on stakeholder priority and potential impact on the environment, economy, and society. So that's how GRI just generally calls material topics. That's how they define it. SASB is the other one that you've probably heard of. And that is a little bit different because it's focused more on what's financially material, and it's very focused on from the investor perspective. So I'm oversimplifying, but ultimately GRI is intended to be more holistic and involving all stakeholders, and SASB is focused on the financially material topics and really focused on the investor lens. So we're going to dive into each one of these a little bit so you can see what that means. Ultimately, most of the time, companies combine these 2, and that's often what we do as well. But we're going to start with the GRI. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing an example framework, just like you saw in the slide deck and from Julie. That's the materiality matrix on the right-hand side. So let's demystify this. So the y-axis is really fundamentally asking the question, which ESG topics are priorities for internal and external stakeholders? Ultimately, that's what it boils down to. What do they care about? What are they prioritizing? And the process is relatively straightforward. As we kind of alluded to already, you can send out surveys, have a lot of interviews, have workshops or facilitated discussions to determine priorities, and supplement that with research. So I would say the y-axis is usually an easier one to at least understand and navigate. Oftentimes the x-axis is where the challenge really comes in, and that's really about what potential impacts do these ESG topics have. And that's really hard to quantify. And it's not necessarily clear on how to do that. For some things, it's easier than others. You know, for greenhouse gas emissions, for example, that's pretty easy to quantify, and you can understand like how much potential impact that has on the environment and society. So I'm just going to talk you through how SES, like what our process is, and I think this is similar to other folks too, but we focus on industry and geography. So how important are these topics for your industry, and how important are they for your geography in which you operate, or geographies? So to showcase what that could look like, we're going to dive in. I guess before that, I want to point out really quickly that the x-axis, I think a lot of companies have been doing this a little incorrectly. So it's really focusing, the point is to focus on what the potential impact is on environment and society, and not on what impacts are caused on your company. So it's meant to be what can you do, not what would happen to you. So I just wanted to point that out as something to keep an eye out for as you can proceed with your materiality assessments. So to diving into that x-axis just a little bit more and explain why it's important to include both industry and geography, we're just going to show an example for water risks in the transportation industry. So, you know, for the transportation industry, you know, you don't necessarily think of water very often, which is the case here in terms of what risks are out there in the world. So we can see here based on this, we have a lot of different metrics that go into this score, but ultimately by industry, water is not a big risk for transportation, so it gets a low score. So for this company, however, they operate in very water-stressed regions where water availability is a really big concern. So by taking the geographies in which this company operates, we can develop a score based on that. And so that's much higher. So it's 6.5 versus 0.42. And so if you chose one process over the other, if you chose only to focus on industry, this would not be a material aspect. But if you focused only on geographies, it would be probably. And so combining these scores really helps us understand more holistically what the overall impact is, and also reporting out on each of those individually. So I just wanted to showcase why it's important to consider both of those. So now diving into SASB a little bit, again, this is, it's very similar, right? It's what are important issues for your company, but from a financial perspective and from an investor lens. So SASB has honestly done a lot of the work for you in determining what priority topics to consider. So I'll just showcase this here. So this is the materiality map that SASB has. You could Google this right now and get to it very quickly. But ultimately on the left-hand side, they share the dimensions, you know, the categories that they assess against. And then on the top, you can see the broad industries that they showcase what is material to the company. So in this case, the consumer goods, you can see in energy management, that is a material topic because it's covered in gray. What is nice about this is they also dive into a little bit more specific. So you can click on consumer goods and see all these different categories. So here again, looking at apparel, accessories, and footwear, you can see that product quality and safety is a material issue. And if you click again, you'll be able to see what metrics they actually recommend that you follow and track. And so this is a really great way to determine what to focus on. I think that the main challenges with this approach that we've experienced is that some companies don't necessarily fit really well into one of these boxes, or you know, they span across multiple industries. So you still have the challenge of figuring out which aspects are material across the board. And so that's something that's commonly difficult. However, again, oftentimes, because this is only focused on, or more focused on the investor lens, typically companies use both SASB material topics and GRI topics as they evaluate what's material. And that's what we would recommend as well. Okay, so we shared a lot of information. What I wanted to do now is just really briefly go through and remind us of like what we discussed. So first we talked about the gap assessment. And this is using an existing standard or framework to assess gaps. It's great because there's already an existing framework that you can use. You don't have to create one. Oftentimes there are scores and weights that you can figure out priorities based on that. It's challenging because it's limited in perspective, can often be internal facing, and there's no stakeholder inclusion. Benchmarking, again, you can compare yourselves to industry peers using an existing standard or otherwise, and it really helps you get a sense of the industry landscape and how you differentiate, but the information you're able to get is often limited, and stakeholders aren't explicitly included. Risk assessments, so really evaluating risks, and you can use an existing framework or create your own. It's a great way to assign potential costs to ESG topics, especially if you're trying to, excuse me, navigate getting, securing a budget for future years. So it's really a great way to understand, like, scale-wise, how much cost is associated with certain risks, which can facilitate easier buy-in from key stakeholders. It's oftentimes internal facing, can be difficult to do it independently, and stakeholders aren't explicitly included, although they can and should be. Materiality, we just talked about that. There are a lot of things there. Ultimately, it includes stakeholders. It's a very familiar framework, and it's really easy to take a strategy from that perspective, but it can be very time consuming. As Julie mentioned, their first one took about a year. It doesn't always take that long, right? It can depend on the company and what you're assessing, but it can take a decent amount of time. It can be difficult to do independently. So overall, these are the 4 pathways. Ultimately, these are options. Many companies, as you've heard from Julie, do several or all of these. So if you're just figuring out where to start, hopefully this will give you some ideas of what the pros and cons are to each method, and to think through what's the right fit for your company. Ultimately and overall, I think the important thing really is that whatever methodology you use, it's really helpful to have a distinct way to showcase and communicate why you chose the ESG topics that you did. And that'll really help guide future conversations and have some security and developing goals and putting budget and resources towards these initiatives, because then you'll be able to always return back to that framework and say, hey, we're prioritizing this because of this. So it's really helpful to navigate. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we just want to very briefly go over what to do with this stuff. So now that you've really narrowed down the topics using one of those 4 methods, ideally you'll have a very defined list, hopefully something manageable. And really the question is, what do you do with those? So really that's when the real work begins. And it's an ongoing process. It's a journey. You're never going to get off the journey. It's just constantly evolving. So regardless of what methods you use to establish priorities, once they're determined, it's time to focus on developing goals and implementing change. So ultimately, the goal then is to take these topics, whatever they are for your company and your industry, and develop a strategy and goals and targets around those. So the first step is communicating about them, asking stakeholders, what potential goals they want to see, circulating this and getting a sense of telling people your story and how you develop these topics. Establishing metrics for each topic around time-bound goals and targets. Developing strategies and roadmaps, like Julie mentioned as well. You'll want to be able to clearly see the path forward for each goal that you create. And also, really importantly, assign responsibilities to make sure that those goals actually happen, and communication strategies to get constantly updated. And with that, you'll need to monitor and track and manage progress, and make sure that you understand and can communicate and report out how you're progressing on these material or like high priority topics. And then lastly, really share the successes and barriers of your experience. This is not an easy journey. It's a never-ending journey, and you deserve to showcase what you're working on, internally and externally. And this is what we're going to be focusing on in the second webinar, is how to report, or some of the common frameworks that you can use to report on your ESG topics. And ultimately, the goal is to continuously improve. There's no right or wrong way. It's all company specific and is based on what you think can happen in your company. But ultimately, the important thing is that you're on this journey, and together we'll make the world a better place. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Karen, and thank you all so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Brittany and Julie. We do have a number of questions, and I think just to start out, I'd like to ask Julie, with a large company like yours, and if someone is relatively new to sustainability, how would you suggest that they get their internal teams involved and committed in becoming stakeholders in the sustainability process and goal setting?
So the recommendation I always have is focus on the material topics that matter to your business. So if I think back to our beginning, energy, we're a huge energy user. So energy was a material topic that we knew we could gain buy-in easily. We knew it would matter to the business, matter to our employees globally. Start where it matters, focus on those areas, show where they are impacting that goal, the value that they bring, the positive impact they have on the goal. That's where I would recommend starting, and then you can branch out from there as you get your arms around that. Don't feel that you have to tackle everything at once.
Wonderful. Yes, it's important to get started. Brittany, a question for you. We have talked a lot about stakeholders. Can you give examples of stakeholders?
Oh, sure, yeah. And I think stakeholders could, vary for each company, but ultimately it's investors, boards of directors, NGOs, employees, customers, suppliers. The list goes on and on. Ultimately, we first evaluate, the level of influence your stakeholders have on your company and the level, and to help establish which stakeholders to reach out to. But we'll gather like a list of internal and external stakeholders that are most have the most potential influence on your company as we work with them.
Okay, great. And a follow-on question about SASB materiality. Would you recommend analyzing materiality using the SASB definition, even if a company is not publicly held?
That's a great question. I think it's helpful. I do. I think it's useful to see what material aspects they identify to at least get a grounding for what you may want to focus on. And ultimately, it's if you do a more, the GRI version of a materiality assessment, it doesn't hurt to ask your stakeholders if those material topics are also important to them. It can't hurt to include those. So it's a great way to go to just get an understanding of what potential topics to include in your assessment.
Mm-hmm. This could be potentially a question for both of you, but I know that you mentioned that one of the cons of a benchmarking exercise was the availability of transparent information for competitors or benchmarking companies. Can you share any potential resources that might be used to find that information?
Yeah, I guess I can take a start, and Julie, feel free to add on. So typically, I think it kind of depends on what framework you are looking at. So if you are looking at one, so let me talk generally first. If you're just looking generally how a company, you compare against a company, we often go to their sustainability reports. We'll look at broad, industry standards or publicly reported information like CDP reports grades and scores. You can go to science-based targets and see if they've committed. So there are a lot of those like general platforms where there's databases that show like what companies are doing and what they're working on. So it's a combination of using those public resources, but also focusing in on their sustainability reports if they have them. And really, it's just kind of trolling their websites and public information. We also take a look at like news and media for companies because they may have press releases that are out there, but they're not necessarily reported on their website very explicitly. So it's really a little bit of digging to figure out what's out there. And Julie, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, we do the same thing. We do a lot of trolling the website, or websites. We also use CDP and other mechanisms. We also invested, I guess, a couple years ago in an AI tool that we use called Data Moran to do a lot of benchmarking work as well. That allows us to. It helped us with materiality as well as benchmarking.
Great, great. There are a number of questions about small and medium-sized companies. What would you think is the most suitable place to start for a small to medium-sized company? Which framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's hard because it kind of depends. I would say if you're a small to medium-sized company and there's no budget, which often happens, I think that the gap assessment and benchmarking assessments are great places to start. Because that's something you can do internally if you have the resources available to you. So those are probably the places to start. But regardless, if you are, I think the answer to that question depends a little bit on what you intend to do next. So for example, if you are planning to figure out topics this year and you want to report publicly next year, part of most companies report using the GRI framework. So if that's something you want to do, then you might consider doing a materiality assessment now, because that's part of the requirements for GRI. So it's a little bit about what is your end game, but also what are you capable to do time and budget wise right now? And the answer, if you don't have a lot of budget, is to do the benchmarking and gap assessment.
Right. Of course, time and budget is one of the questions. And I know in terms of time, for a company like Owens Corning, it's an around the clock, around the year activity. But I think to initially get started with a simple assessment and some goal setting, that can be done for a small company in a relatively, quick period of time. But I don't know, Brittany, do you want to weigh in on that a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, I guess I don't think so. I think, it's, for a small company that's just starting and there's limited budget, I think the first thing you'll need to understand and determine is where is the pressure coming from? If you're getting pressured from your customers to report to a certain framework, or if you're getting, maybe you're getting sent supplier questionnaires, right? And you don't have the ability to answer those questionnaires because you're not focusing on the questions that they're asking. So those things, I think really understanding where the pressure comes from can help guide you in what the best path is. But if you're getting pressured to report to something, then doing a gap assessment is definitely the next step to figure out how you can at least fill the most important gaps in a short time frame.
Then there was another question about grading. How do you calculate the adherence of the action the company's taken and reported to the relevance in ESG? So when you were showing those sort of graded examples, how do you assign those grades?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a complicated answer, unfortunately. So, at SCS, we do a lot of materiality assessments. So we've developed a materiality assessment tool that we've kind of curated over several years. And we've really taken a bunch of academic and industry resources and compiled them into that tool. And so for each metric, we may look at up to 4 or 5 different data points, and those can vary all over the place. I think the ones that I shared were from a water risk map, so WWF water risk map, and also the CDP water risks questionnaire. They have a report that showed by industry where water risks are self-reported. So it's a lot of research, and that's why it's really hard to do the materiality assessments independently, because that's a lot of time for your company to dedicate resources to. But that's where we get those numbers from, is publicly available information. Yeah.
Here's a question about materiality. I might be able to answer it, but I'll just get it out there. For materiality, to what extent might you prioritize low-hanging fruit over topics that are found to be of high stakeholder importance and high impact? I think the question is, when would you prioritize maybe something that's low-hanging in the lower quadrant above things that are in the upper quadrant? And I'll let you open on that.
Yeah, that's a good, I think, it's so company specific. I think ultimately what's tough about that is, everything in the materiality grid is important. And so helping to determine what's in the upper right quadrant will help you figure out what's quote unquote most important. But, again, you may have a specific stakeholder request that is asking you to focus on a topic that's at least visually less priority, and then that you should focus on that and make sure, if you need to, especially if your business is going to be affected if you don't. So it really comes down to who's asking for that information. Another example is, if your industry broadly is all, oftentimes when we help companies with this, we'll do a benchmarking assessment first. So we'll benchmark against priority topics, identify high priority topics, and then incorporate those into the materiality assessment.
Right.
And so if the entire industry is focusing on a topic and you're not, then that might warrant you prioritizing it, even if the grid doesn't indicate that you should. Does that help answer the question?
I think so. It's one of the things that I think is interesting about materiality assessment is that it is something that stays with you and can be used when issues crop up within your company. That's something that you can refer back to. Well, these are the most important topics to us. These are material topics to our company. But that's not to say that you wouldn't, if there is some low-hanging fruit in the lower quadrant, that those aren't things that you should fix right away. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think the way to kind of frame it is like the priority topics is what you are kind of more actively engaged in and set goals around and dedicate more resources to. That doesn't mean that you should ignore everything else. Maybe it's, you're still working on them, but it's more of like monitoring and like gradually improving and finding opportunities where it's easy to. So definitely don't deprioritize anything, but it's just the top upper right quadrant is really where we recommend focusing your attention. And you're exactly right. That materiality assessment is a great communication tool. If somebody's asking you to focus on something, be like, hey, we're going to get to it, but right now, this is what we've identified as important to our company. So we're going to focus our time and effort on this.
And to what extent do like GRI and SASB cross over? So one of the questions was, can a SASB materiality assessment be used to report to GRI?
Yeah, I think so. That's typically what we do. So we'll incorporate like the SASB topics into the GRI materiality assessment. I think that, combining those two is often really helpful, and they do overlap. A lot of they overlap in a lot of topic categories, but not always, because the SASB standard is really focused on what's important from an investor perspective. So by not including other stakeholders, you may lose sight of what other folks in your circle will want you to incorporate.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of overlap. And Julie, feel free to add on. She mentioned this earlier, but a lot of these standards and frameworks have very similar categories, and they often touch on the same things, so that they do overlap in a lot of ways, and you can capture both.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you again, and I know Tom has some parting remarks. We are at the top of the hour, and I want to thank both Brittany and Julie for joining us. And Owens Corning will be back for the third webinar, so please sign up for the next two webinars. And Tom, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Karen, and thank you to Julie and Brittany for being our guests today. We hope everybody's found this information valuable. Today's presentation has been recorded and will be sent out to all registrants and attendees within the next 24 hours. And we hope you'll be able to join us for the next webinar in the series, ESG Reporting, Choosing the Right Approach for Your Company, which will take place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, April 21st. If you need a registration link or have any additional questions, please feel free to contact me via email. Until then, we hope you all stay safe and healthy and have a great day.